It started with a rumor. Not a press release, not an official announcement, just a single whisper that slipped out of a training facility and detonated across the internet within minutes. According to multiple insiders, something had happened inside the walls of Team USA's camp that no one expected. A moment so tense, so unexpected, that staff members reportedly held emergency meetings before the public even knew anything was wrong. At the center of the storm were two of the biggest names in women's basketball. On one side was Aya Wilson, the dominant force who had spent years building her reputation as one of the most powerful players in the sport. A champion. A leader. The kind of veteran presence every international team depends on. On the other side was Caitlin Clark, the rookie phenomenon who had walked into professional basketball with more attention than almost any player before her. One represented the established order. The other represented the future. And according to people close to the situation, the collision between those two worlds was inevitable. But here's the part that shocked everyone. This wasn't just about competition. It wasn't just about ego, media hype, or the usual tension between veterans and newcomers. Insiders began hinting that something much deeper had been uncovered behind the scenes. Something connected to internal decisions, long-standing traditions inside USA basketball, and a structure that most fans never even knew existed. The rumors spread fast. Some claimed Caitlin Clark had accidentally stumbled across information she wasn't supposed to see. Others believed the conflict had been building quietly for weeks before anyone outside the locker room noticed. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. The moment Caitlin Clark arrived around Team USA, the energy changed. Teammates noticed it first. The cameras noticed it next. And eventually, the entire basketball world did too. Because suddenly every conversation seemed to circle back to the same question. Was this just another case of a superstar rookie stepping into a veteran locker room? Or had Caitlin Clark unknowingly walked straight into a power structure that had been operating quietly for years? At first, nobody thought the situation would grow this serious. But looking back now, insiders say the warning signs were already there. And the first cracks appeared the very moment Caitlin Clark stepped into that gym. When Caitlin Clark first arrived around Team USA activities, everything on the surface looked normal. Players were smiling. Cameras were flashing. Social media was full of photos showing teammates laughing together, posing for media day, talking about chemistry and the mission to bring home another gold medal. From the outside, it looked like the same program fans had watched for years. Dominant, unified, unstoppable. But according to people who were actually inside those practices, the atmosphere felt a little different the moment Clark walked into the gym. Not hostile. Not aggressive. Just different. Because Caitlin Clark wasn't just another rookie hoping to earn minutes. She arrived with something very few first-year players ever bring into a professional locker room. An enormous spotlight. By the time she stepped onto that floor, she had already become one of the most talked-about athletes in the entire sport. Arena attendance numbers were exploding. Television ratings were climbing. Every game she played suddenly became a national event. And whether anyone wanted to admit it or not, that level of attention changes the energy in a room. Veterans who had spent years carrying the league were now watching the cameras slowly shift toward someone who hadn't even played a full professional season yet. Some players embraced it. A few teammates reportedly welcomed Clark immediately, impressed by her confidence and the way she handled the pressure. But others were more cautious. Because inside a program like Team USA, there's always been an unspoken structure. A hierarchy. Not something written down anywhere. Not something publicly acknowledged. But everyone who enters the system eventually understands it. Veterans lead. Newcomers observe. Respect is earned slowly over time. For years, players like Aya Wilson had helped define that culture. Wilson wasn't just another talented player on the roster. She had become one of the most recognizable faces in women's basketball, someone younger players looked up to. So when Clark arrived with massive media attention already surrounding her, the contrast became impossible to ignore. One insider later described the moment perfectly. They said the gym didn't go silent when Caitlin walked in. But the conversations definitely changed. Reporters started asking different questions. Cameras followed her during warm-ups. And every time she touched the ball during practice, people seemed to watch just a little more closely. At first, most players assumed the hype would settle down. That's usually what happens with rookies. The excitement fades, the season moves forward, and the locker room naturally returns to its usual rhythm. But Caitlin Clark wasn't behaving like a typical rookie either. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't quiet. And most importantly, she wasn't afraid to speak up. That was the first thing teammates noticed. Clark asked questions constantly. Not just about plays or shooting drills. She asked about strategies, rotations, and decision-making. She wanted to understand why certain things were done a certain way. To her, it was normal curiosity. To some veterans, it felt like something else. Because inside a system built on long-standing leadership, questions can sometimes sound a lot like challenges. And slowly, quietly, people inside the facility began to realize something. Caitlin Clark wasn't just learning the system. She was examining it. And that's when the tension really started to grow. At first, it showed up in small moments. A glance during practice. A quiet conversation between teammates after drills. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make headlines. But the longer training continued, the clearer one thing became. The rookie everyone expected to quietly observe the system was starting to look at it much more closely than anyone anticipated. And eventually, that curiosity would lead Caitlin Clark into a moment she was never supposed to witness. At first, Caitlin Clark's questions seemed harmless. Every rookie asks questions when they join a new environment. Learning the system, understanding the coaching philosophy, figuring out how teammates communicate on the court, those things are completely normal. But Clark's curiosity didn't stop at the surface. She wasn't just asking about plays. She was asking why certain decisions were made. Why certain rotations happened during scrimmages. Why some players were moved around the court while others stayed in the same roles no matter what happened. To Caitlin, it was just part of learning. She had always played basketball that way. Analyzing everything, understanding patterns, looking for ways to make the team better. That mindset was one of the reasons she became such a dangerous player. But inside a long-established program like Team USA, curiosity can sometimes create uncomfortable moments. Because systems that have been running smoothly for years usually rely on one simple rule. Don't question the structure. Most players who enter the program understand this almost immediately. The veterans set the tone. The coaching staff runs the strategy. And younger players slowly earn their place over time. It's not written anywhere. But everyone understands it. Except Caitlin Clark didn't arrive with that mindset. She arrived with the mindset of someone who had spent her entire career breaking expectations. So when she noticed things that didn't make sense to her, she simply asked about them. Why was one lineup used repeatedly even when another group was performing better during practice? Why were certain defensive assignments locked in place no matter who was scoring the most? Why were some strategy meetings held without the full team present? None of these questions were aggressive. In fact, several teammates later described Clark as calm and respectful when she asked them. But the questions themselves started spreading through the locker room. And eventually, they reached the ears of players who had helped shape the culture of the program. Players like Aya Wilson. Wilson had been part of the Team USA system long enough to understand exactly how the internal balance worked. She had earned her place through years of dominance, leadership, and championship-level performances. From her perspective, the system worked. The program kept winning. The culture stayed strong. So when a rookie began poking around the inner mechanics of that structure, it naturally raised some eyebrows. Not because anyone believed Caitlin Clark was trying to cause problems, but because questions have a strange way of spreading. One player asks something. Another player starts thinking about it. Soon the entire room is wondering the same thing. And in high-level sports programs, the last thing coaches want is players questioning the structure that keeps the team unified. Still, none of this meant the situation was about to explode. At least not yet. For a while, the tension remained subtle. Small conversations. Quiet disagreements. Nothing public. Nothing dramatic. Until one practice scrimmage changed everything. Because during that scrimmage, Caitlin Clark did something that no rookie had done in that environment for a very long time. She corrected someone. And the player she corrected happened to be closely connected to the very top of the locker room hierarchy. The moment the words left her mouth, several teammates later said the gym felt different. Not louder. Not chaotic. Just suddenly, tense. And standing only a few steps away from that moment was the player who represented the established order of the team. The moment that insiders still talk about didn't happen during a game, a press conference, or even a televised practice. It happened during a closed scrimmage session inside the training facility, a session that wasn't meant to attract any attention at all. No reporters were present, no cameras were rolling, and no one outside the program was supposed to know what unfolded on that court. At first, the scrimmage felt like any other practice competition. Players rotated through lineups, coaches called out instructions, and the gym echoed with the familiar rhythm of sneakers cutting across hardwood. The intensity was high, but that wasn't unusual. When elite athletes practice together, competitiveness is expected. Everyone wants to prove they deserve their place. Caitlin Clark was running the offense for one of the units during that stretch, moving the ball quickly and trying to keep the pace high. Anyone who has watched her play knows that she thrives in chaotic moments, when decisions have to be made quickly and the floor opens up for creativity. That same style showed up during the scrimmage. She pushed the ball forward, spotted a teammate cutting toward the basket, and delivered a sharp pass that turned into an easy score. Under normal circumstances, it would have been the kind of play that earns quick nods from teammates before everyone resets for the next possession. But as players began jogging back up the court, something unusual happened. A veteran voice cut through the gym. Instructions were being called out loudly toward the teammate who had just scored, correcting positioning and defensive assignments for the next play. The tone wasn't friendly guidance. It carried an edge that several players immediately noticed. Clark paused for a moment, clearly confused by what she was hearing. From her perspective, the play had unfolded exactly the way it was supposed to. The teammate had been in the right place, the timing had worked perfectly, and the possession had ended with points. So she said something. Not aggressively. Not confrontationally. Just a simple observation that the play had actually worked the way it was drawn up. For a brief second, the entire gym seemed to freeze. Teammates later described the moment as strangely quiet, the kind of silence that falls over a room when everyone realizes a conversation is about to turn uncomfortable. Because the veteran delivering those instructions was closely aligned with the leadership structure of the locker room. And standing nearby, watching the entire exchange unfold, was Aya Wilson. Wilson had built her reputation as one of the strongest voices on the floor. She was respected for it. Teammates trusted her instincts, and coaches often relied on that leadership during intense moments. But this time, the situation felt different. According to people who witnessed the exchange, Wilson stepped in almost immediately. Her response wasn't loud enough to echo through the gym, but it was firm enough that everyone nearby heard it clearly. The message was simple. Rookies didn't come into this environment telling established players how things should be done. Clark looked surprised. Not defensive, just genuinely caught off guard by how quickly the situation had escalated. She tried to clarify that she was only talking about the play itself, about helping the team communicate more clearly. But the moment had already shifted the mood. Players began drifting back into position for the next possession, yet the energy inside the gym no longer felt the same. The competitive edge that usually fuels scrimmages had been replaced by something heavier. Awkwardness. A few teammates avoided eye contact. Others quietly exchanged glances as if trying to read the room. Even the coaching staff seemed aware that something unusual had just taken place, though they allowed practice to continue without interruption. For the rest of the session, the scrimmage carried a strange tension that hadn't been there earlier. Every pass, every defensive rotation, every call from the sideline seemed slightly more intense than before. And when practice finally ended, players didn't linger on the court the way they sometimes did. They headed toward the locker room quickly, conversations low and private. From the outside, nothing dramatic had happened. There were no shouting matches, no public confrontations, nothing that would immediately signal a major problem inside the program. But insiders would later say that moment marked the first time the underlying tension became visible. Because what looked like a small disagreement during practice was actually the first sign of something deeper. It revealed the invisible line between the old guard and the newcomer who wasn't afraid to speak up. And once that line had been crossed, the situation inside the facility began to shift in ways no one had expected. But the scrimmage itself wasn't the moment that truly shook the program. That moment came later. Later that day, when Caitlin Clark walked into a room she wasn't supposed to be in and noticed something sitting on a desk that would send her thoughts racing. Something that didn't look like an ordinary coaching note. Something that hinted at a system operating behind the scenes. The practice ended the way most intense practices do. Players gathered their gear, some headed toward the locker room, others toward the training area to grab ice or stretch before the next meeting. Conversations were quiet, scattered across the hallway as everyone slowly shifted out of competition mode. Caitlin Clark followed the same routine most players do after a long session. She grabbed a towel, walked toward the training room, and was about to pass by a side office when something unusual caught her attention. The door wasn't fully closed. Inside the room, papers were spread across a desk. Clipboards, folders, and printed practice notes were stacked in the kind of organized chaos that usually fills coaching offices during training camp. Normally, a player would walk right past something like that without thinking twice. But this time, one sheet of paper sat face up in a way that made it impossible not to notice. Clark slowed down for just a moment. At first glance, the paper looked like a normal roster sheet. Team USA staff members constantly review rotations, minutes, defensive matchups, and lineup combinations during camp. It's part of the preparation process for any international tournament. But something about this sheet looked different. Next to several names were short handwritten notes written in red marker. Some looked like typical coaching abbreviations, things like defensive focus or matchup reminders. But one phrase stood out immediately. Protected. Clark reportedly stared at the note for a second longer than she meant to. It wasn't the word itself that seemed strange. Coaches sometimes use shorthand to label players during evaluations. What caught her attention was how the word was written next to certain names. And the name that stood out most was Aya Wilson. Beside it were additional initials and short codes that Clark didn't immediately understand. The kind of internal language that staff members sometimes use when discussing lineup stability or leadership roles inside a team. Still, the phrasing felt unusual. Protected from what? Protected by who? For a second, Clark considered that she might simply be misunderstanding what she was looking at. Training camps are full of complex evaluation systems, and coaching staffs often track dozens of factors during roster decisions. But the longer she looked, the more questions started forming. Several other names had notes too, though none of them carried the same wording. Some had symbols indicating rotation possibilities. Others had arrows showing positional flexibility. Yet only a few had the word, protected. Clark didn't take the paper. She didn't move anything on the desk. According to insiders, she simply glanced at the sheet, memorized what she could, and kept walking down the hallway. But the thought stayed with her. Because the idea of a protected player inside a competitive roster environment didn't match the philosophy she had grown up with. In every program she had ever played in, positions were supposed to be earned. Performance decided who played. Competition decided who stayed. So the idea that certain names might carry a different kind of status didn't sit comfortably in her mind. Still, at that point it was nothing more than a moment of curiosity. Clark didn't accuse anyone of anything. She didn't start an argument or confront the coaching staff. If anything, the situation simply left her confused. But rumors inside sports facilities travel fast. And by the time players gathered again for the next team meeting, whispers had already started circulating. Someone had seen something. Someone had asked questions. And the word, protected, was suddenly being repeated quietly between conversations. No one knew exactly where the rumor started. Some believed it came from a staff member who noticed Clark lingering near the office. Others thought a teammate simply overheard part of a conversation and connected the dots later. Either way, the idea spread quickly. Within hours, several players were wondering the same thing Clark had wondered in that hallway. Was the roster really built only on performance? Or were certain players operating under a different set of rules? Inside USA basketball, those kinds of questions can create serious tension. The program has built its reputation on dominance and unity for decades. Publicly, the system has always been presented as a merit-based structure built around excellence. So when whispers about hidden advantages begin circulating, the reaction inside the organization tends to be immediate. Staff members started holding additional meetings. Conversations moved behind closed doors. And players were quietly reminded to stay focused on preparation rather than speculation. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. Training camp continued. Practices ran on schedule. Media appearances stayed positive and upbeat. But behind the scenes, the atmosphere inside the facility had clearly changed. Because now there was a rumor floating through the locker room. A rumor that suggested the structure of the team might not be as simple as everyone believed. And whether that rumor was true or not almost didn't matter anymore. Once an idea like that enters a competitive environment, it spreads faster than anyone can control. Soon the tension wasn't just about one scrimmage moment or one sheet of paper. It was about trust. And that's when the situation started pulling the entire team into two very different directions. Rumors inside elite sports teams have a strange life of their own. They rarely explode all at once. Instead, they spread quietly at first, moving from one conversation to another, passing through locker rooms, training tables, and late-night phone calls between teammates trying to figure out what's really going on. That's exactly what began happening inside the Team USA environment. At first, only a few players had heard about the strange note on the roster sheet. The story traveled quietly through side conversations, mostly among younger players who were still trying to understand the structure of the program. Some of them brushed it off immediately. After all, training camps are full of internal notes and coaching shorthand that can easily be misunderstood. But others couldn't stop thinking about it. Because once the word protected entered the discussion, it started connecting with other small things people had noticed during camp. Why certain rotations rarely changed. Why some players seemed to have more influence during strategy discussions. Why certain decisions appeared to be made behind closed doors before the rest of the team ever heard about them. None of those things were unusual by themselves. Every team has leadership dynamics, especially at the international level where veteran players carry years of experience and credibility. But when the rumor about that document started circulating, some players began viewing those same dynamics through a completely different lens. And that's when the atmosphere inside the locker room slowly began to shift. Some teammates immediately defended the existing structure. From their perspective, veterans like Aya Wilson had earned their authority over time. They had carried the program through multiple tournaments, championships, and Olympic cycles. If those players had more influence, it was simply the natural result of years of leadership and success. To them, the system wasn't unfair. It was experienced leadership guiding younger players. But others began asking quieter questions. If leadership was the only factor, why would it need to be written down in a way that looked official? Why label certain players differently if everything was purely based on performance and experience? No one was openly accusing anyone of anything yet. But the conversations kept happening. Some players started discussing the issue privately in small groups. Others chose to stay completely out of it, focusing only on practice and preparation. A few veterans reportedly warned teammates not to get distracted by rumors that could damage team chemistry. Still, the tension was becoming harder to ignore. Even the coaching staff could sense that something had changed. During one meeting, a coach reportedly addressed the team with a simple reminder that Team USA's success had always depended on unity and trust. The message was clear without mentioning the rumor directly. Focus on basketball. Ignore outside noise. Trust the system. But by that point, the noise wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was already inside the building. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark found herself in an uncomfortable position she had never intended to create. She hadn't started the rumor. She hadn't accused anyone publicly. In fact, people close to the situation later suggested that Clark was surprised to hear how far the story had spread. What had started as a moment of curiosity in a hallway was now becoming a topic that entire groups of players were discussing. And the more attention the rumor received, the more people began associating Clark with the entire situation. Some teammates believed she was simply asking fair questions. Others worried that her curiosity had unintentionally stirred up something that could damage the team's chemistry before a major international tournament. In a locker room filled with elite competitors, even small disagreements can quickly become emotional. Players care deeply about their reputations, their roles, and the legacy of the programs they represent. So when whispers about internal favoritism began circulating, it was almost inevitable that opinions would split. One side believed the system worked exactly as it should. The other side wasn't so sure anymore. And standing right in the middle of that divide were the two players whose names kept coming up in every conversation. The established leader, and the rookie who had unknowingly asked the question that started everything. For a while, the tension stayed contained within the team. But the moment it reached social media, the situation changed completely. Because once the internet got involved, the story stopped belonging to the locker room. It became a global debate. For a few days, everything stayed contained inside the program. Practices continued. Team meetings followed the usual schedule. Publicly, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Interviews stayed upbeat, social media posts showed teammates laughing together, and the outside world had no reason to suspect that anything unusual was happening behind the scenes. But in the modern sports world, very few things stay private for long. All it takes is one message, one screenshot, one anonymous tip sent to the wrong person. And suddenly a story that was never supposed to leave the building begins spreading across the internet faster than anyone can control. That's exactly what happened. Late one evening, a short post appeared on social media from an account known for sharing behind-the-scenes sports rumors. It didn't mention specific details. It didn't accuse anyone directly. But it asked a question that immediately caught people's attention. Is something going on inside Team USA camp involving a protected player? Within minutes, the post began gaining traction. At first, fans treated it like any other vague sports rumor. Speculation comes and goes online every day, and most of it disappears just as quickly as it appears. But this time, the timing was suspiciously perfect. Because inside the program, the exact same word had already been circulating among players. Protected. Suddenly, the conversation inside the locker room was spilling out into the public world. Fans started connecting the dots almost immediately. Message boards lit up with theories. Comment sections filled with speculation. People began digging through past interviews, roster decisions, and old articles searching for any sign that something unusual might have been happening behind the scenes. Before long, two names kept appearing over and over again in those discussions. Caitlin Clark and Aya Wilson. Neither player had said anything publicly about the rumors. In fact, both continued focusing on basketball the same way they always had. But the internet rarely waits for confirmation before forming opinions. Within hours, fans had split into completely different camps. Some people believed Clark had simply asked questions that exposed something deeper about how decisions were made inside the program. To them, she represented a new generation of players who expected transparency and fairness. Others believed the rumors were unfairly targeting veteran leaders who had spent years building the success of Team USA. From their perspective, questioning that leadership was disrespectful and unnecessary. The debate grew louder with every passing hour. Hashtags began trending. Podcasters started discussing the rumor on live streams. Sports commentators began mentioning the situation cautiously, careful not to repeat anything that couldn't be verified but clearly aware that the conversation was spreading quickly. Meanwhile, inside the program, the reaction was immediate. Staff members held emergency discussions about how to contain the story. Players were quietly reminded not to engage with speculation online. Public relations teams began monitoring the situation closely, watching every post and every comment that mentioned the team. The concern wasn't just about one rumor. It was about timing. Major international tournaments demand total focus, and even small distractions can disrupt preparation. The last thing the program needed was a public controversy pulling attention away from basketball. But by the time those conversations were happening behind closed doors, the internet had already taken control of the narrative. New theories were appearing every hour. Some people claimed there were internal documents proving certain players had unusual influence inside the program. Others believed the entire story was exaggerated drama created by fans looking for controversy. And then another rumor started spreading. This one suggested that the situation inside USA Basketball had become serious enough that leadership might be forced to address it internally. No one knew if that claim was true, but the mere possibility of internal action was enough to send the discussion into overdrive. Because if the organization really was reviewing something behind the scenes, that meant the story might not be just a rumor anymore. And suddenly the entire basketball world was watching closely, waiting to see what would happen next. But what no one expected was how personal the situation would become. Because as the debate continued growing online, the pressure on the players themselves started to rise. Especially on the rookie whose name had somehow become attached to the center of the storm. As the conversation outside continued to spiral across social media, something quieter was happening inside the leadership offices connected to USA Basketball. The coaches and administrators had seen situations like this before. Rumors, speculation, and fan debates are part of modern sports. Usually the strategy is simple. Stay silent, let the noise fade, and keep the focus on the game. But this time the situation felt different. Because the rumor hadn't started outside. It had started inside the building. That meant there was a real concern about how far the story could spread if players continued talking about it among themselves. Even if most of the speculation online was exaggerated, the possibility that private internal discussions were leaking out created a serious problem for the program. So leadership began holding a series of quiet meetings. Nothing dramatic. No public announcements. Just closed doors and serious conversations about how to stabilize the situation before it affected the team's preparation. Several insiders later suggested that the main goal of those meetings wasn't to punish anyone. Instead, the focus was on restoring the one thing every successful team depends on: trust. If players believed the roster process was unfair, even a little, that doubt could quickly poison the locker room environment. And once trust disappears inside a competitive team, rebuilding it becomes extremely difficult. During one meeting, staff members reportedly reviewed the entire sequence of events that had led to the rumors spreading online. They discussed how internal notes had been handled, who might have seen them, and whether any misunderstandings could have fueled the speculation. But another topic quickly became unavoidable: the growing attention around Caitlin Clark. Clark hadn't made any public accusations. She hadn't posted anything online about the rumors. In fact, she had continued practicing and preparing the same way she always had. Yet her name kept appearing in every version of the story circulating on the internet. That created a delicate situation for the organization. On one hand, Clark was one of the most exciting young players in the sport. Her popularity was bringing enormous attention to women's basketball, something the entire league had been working toward for years. On the other hand, the growing narrative suggested she had somehow become the catalyst for a controversy inside the team. Even if that narrative wasn't accurate, perception alone could create tension among players. At the same time, conversations were also happening around Aya Wilson, whose leadership role made her name impossible to avoid in the discussion. Wilson had spent years building her reputation as one of the strongest competitors and most respected voices in the game. For many players, she represented the heart of the veteran leadership that had helped Team USA dominate international basketball for so long. So any suggestion that she had benefited from special treatment instantly triggered strong reactions from fans and teammates alike. Inside those meetings, staff members faced a complicated challenge. They needed to calm the locker room. They needed to prevent further rumors from spreading. And they needed to do it without publicly acknowledging a controversy that might grow even larger if it was officially addressed. So the message delivered to players became very clear. Stay focused. Ignore online speculation. Trust the process. For a moment, it seemed like that strategy might actually work. Practices continued without major disruptions, and most players avoided engaging with the rumors publicly. But the internet rarely moves on that quickly. Because just when it looked like the situation might start cooling down, a new wave of speculation appeared online. This time, the rumors didn't focus only on one player. They suggested something much bigger: the possibility that more than one veteran had influence inside the system. And if that theory turned out to be true, the controversy surrounding Team USA could grow far beyond a single misunderstanding. Suddenly, fans weren't just asking questions about one player. They were asking questions about the entire structure of the program. And once that kind of conversation begins, it becomes very difficult to control. Just when it seemed like the situation might finally start settling down, another rumor surfaced that made everything even more complicated. At first it appeared on a small sports discussion forum, buried inside a long thread where fans were already debating the earlier speculation. Someone posted a short message claiming that the controversy inside Team USA wasn't about one player at all. According to that post, the real story involved more than one veteran. No names were mentioned. No proof was provided. But the phrase, second veteran, immediately caught people's attention. Within hours, screenshots of the comment were circulating across multiple platforms. Fans began repeating the theory everywhere, turning it into the newest piece of the mystery that had been building around the team. The idea was simple but explosive. If one player had been labeled protected, maybe others had been too. Suddenly, the entire conversation shifted. Instead of focusing only on Aya Wilson, fans started scanning the roster and past Olympic teams, looking for clues about which other veterans might have held similar influence. Old interviews were re-watched. Previous roster decisions were re-examined. Even routine coaching comments from past seasons were pulled out and analyzed in a completely different light. None of it confirmed anything. But speculation doesn't need confirmation to spread online. Soon the debate wasn't just about favoritism or leadership anymore. It had grown into something larger, an argument about how elite programs operate behind the scenes. Some fans insisted the rumors proved that hidden power structures existed inside major sports organizations. Others argued that people were simply misunderstanding how veteran leadership works in championship programs. The truth was almost impossible to separate from the noise. But what made the situation especially intense was how the rumors continued circling back to Caitlin Clark. Even though Clark had never publicly confirmed seeing any document or confronting anyone about the rumors, the internet kept placing her at the center of the story. In many versions of the theory spreading online, Clark had accidentally discovered something that exposed the entire system. To some fans, that made her a hero who had brought attention to hidden problems. To others, it made her the person responsible for creating unnecessary drama inside one of the most successful programs in sports. Either way, the attention around her continued growing. Sports talk shows began discussing the speculation cautiously, careful not to repeat unverified claims but clearly aware that the debate had captured the public's imagination. Analysts talked about generational shifts in sports culture, the pressure placed on young superstars, and the complicated balance between veteran leadership and emerging talent. Meanwhile, inside the team environment, players were doing their best to stay focused on basketball. Practices continued. Film sessions continued. But the atmosphere had undeniably changed from what it had been at the beginning of camp. Because once the idea of a second veteran entered the conversation, the rumors stopped feeling like a small internal misunderstanding. They started sounding like something much bigger. Something that might involve decisions made over multiple Olympic cycles. And that possibility created a level of tension that even the most experienced athletes couldn't completely ignore. Still, none of the speculation had been confirmed. No official statements had been made. No players had spoken publicly about the rumors. Yet the conversation kept growing. And eventually, the pressure surrounding the situation began forcing one uncomfortable question into the spotlight. If there really was a deeper system operating behind the scenes, who created it? Because if players like Aya Wilson had simply been part of that structure, then the real power might have been somewhere else entirely. Higher up, inside the leadership of the program itself. And that realization made the entire situation far more serious than anyone had expected when the first rumor appeared. By the time the noise finally began slowing down, the story had already traveled far beyond the walls of a training facility. What started as a quiet rumor about a single note on a roster sheet had turned into one of the most debated conversations in women's basketball. Fans had argued for days. Analysts had dissected every possible angle. Entire podcasts and sports shows had been built around one central mystery. What really happened inside Team USA? The truth is, no official explanation ever arrived that satisfied everyone. The leadership inside USA Basketball continued focusing on the same message they had emphasized from the beginning: unity, preparation, and the mission of representing the country at the highest level of international competition. Practices continued. Game plans were built. And the players kept preparing for the biggest stage in the sport. But the conversation surrounding the program had already changed. Because once fans start asking questions about how decisions are made inside elite organizations, those questions rarely disappear completely. Some people still believe the entire situation was nothing more than a misunderstanding that grew wildly out of control once the internet got involved. From that perspective, a routine internal note may have been misinterpreted, and the resulting speculation simply snowballed into something far larger than reality. Others remain convinced that the controversy revealed something deeper about how power works inside major sports programs. In their eyes, veteran leadership, internal influence, and long-standing relationships sometimes shape decisions in ways fans never see. And somewhere in the middle of those two viewpoints sits the reality that most people inside sports understand very well. Great teams are complicated. Leadership structures evolve over time. And the balance between experience and emerging talent is rarely simple. For players like Aya Wilson, years of success naturally bring influence and respect. That's the reward for proving yourself on the biggest stages again and again. For rising stars like Caitlin Clark, the spotlight arrives quickly, often faster than anyone expects, bringing enormous expectations and attention along with it. When those two worlds meet, tension can sometimes appear, even when everyone involved is ultimately working toward the same goal. And that may be the most important thing to remember about this entire situation. Because despite the rumors, the debates, and the endless online theories, the players themselves never stopped doing what they came there to do: compete, represent their country, and chase another championship. But the questions fans started asking during that moment haven't completely disappeared. Who really shapes the decisions inside elite sports programs? How much influence do veteran leaders truly have behind the scenes? And what happens when a new generation of stars begins looking at the system in a completely different way? Those questions are bigger than one practice, one rumor, or one training camp. They're questions that every great team eventually faces. And sometimes, it only takes one unexpected moment, or one curious rookie, to bring those questions into the spotlight.